Last time we began to discuss MGS2's S3 plan, Selection for Societal Sanity. In this, episode 9 of our Metal Gear Solid 2 retrospective, Existence, we'll discuss the subject really at the heart of the game, postmodernism, and specifically the military entertainment complex. Two elements brought America victory in World War II: oil and full mobilization. As the National Park Service explains, quote, World War II called upon American industry to essentially stop what it had been doing and dedicate everything towards building tanks, planes, and armaments for the Allied forces, end quote. It was this total patriotism that made no distinction between soldier and civilian that helped ignite the dawning of the so-called American century. But by the 1970s, Vietnam became the opposite. A deeply unpopular war, Vietnam and the Watergate incident, which saw the president use former CIA operators to illegally surveil his opponents, gravely injured the military-industrial complex. It was directly from this era, not unlike how life began in the primordial Campbell's soup millennia ago, that we got the evolution as civilian technologies of the computer and the internet. As I covered extensively in Existence Season 1, the technology behind modern 3D games, not to mention more or less all digital electronics, is originally US military made. The earliest 3D arcade games, for example, created by Sega's Yu Suzuki, were literally built on repurposed military simulation hardware, specifically the kind developed to train pilots of fighter jets. Desert Storm was history's first electronic war. It was also the first popular American war since World War II. And the huge leap forward in digital technology that followed it was, to some degree, a direct result of research projects like DARPA's SimNet, which allowed for elaborate tank battles to take place across units in a virtual environment simultaneously for the first time. Many of the battles of Desert Storm were ran in simulation beforehand, which supposedly led to their great success. Meanwhile, a close relationship also emerged in the early 1990s between the US military and shooters like Doom and Quake. Doom was actually reworked to create training software for the US Marine Corps.
I was part of the Army's Force 21 trials.
Force 21? That's about tactical IT deployment, right?
The Force 21 unit that Raiden was in was a real military paradigm in the 1990s. The idea was to use digital technology to achieve networked battlefield situational awareness, using new equipment like synthetic aperture radar, a closed-circuit internet, digital maps, and so-called tactical network integration. Force 21 was a method, a protocol, a circumstance for shaping the future context of military engagement and combat training in the 21st century. Led by TRADOC, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command in Fort Eustis, Virginia, the focus for the Force 21 plan, 21 being a shorthand for 21st century, was saving money and advancing connectivity and efficacy and efficiency of force at the same time, in the same way that AI and supercomputers were now capable of being used to circumvent nuclear treaties and save money by conducting advanced simulated nuclear testing. Using digital wargame simulation technology meant the costs of training the next generation would be lower, and the ability to indoctrinate the next generation in a new military doctrine much easier. The Army Digitization Office, or ADO, came into being in 1994. According to the Institute for Defense Analyses, the ADO's purpose was, quote, to oversee and coordinate the integration of Army battlefield digitization, including the areas of programmatics, technological implementation, and doctrine, end quote. It would oversee a gradual revolution from a digitized brigade to division to an entire digitized corps by 1999. And it would do it by advanced simulation experiments called AWS, Advanced Warfighting Experiments. AWS, by the way, is likely a reference to another doctrine that was emerging out of the Gulf War, shock and awe, also known as rapid dominance. The AWS and the Force 21 concept would mean integrating at all levels of command and control, digital information processing, architectures, the standards and protocols of which would be modeled on those from the commercial world. The goal, again quoting the IDA's report, was, quote, providing the warfighter a seamless flow of timely, accurate, accessible, and secure information, end quote.
Cover, tell them where you're up. All right, I'm coming up behind you. Forward, take my position. You got it? Back up, back up, back up. Here we are, forward. Back up. Celia, get back there with you. Get on his shoulders. What you got?
What you've got is virtual warfare in Marine fatigues. For months, Marine fire teams have been training at computer labs in Virginia, Georgia, and North Carolina, learning battlefield tactics and decision-making.
If they spend a whole lot of time doing that in an operating environment that's kind of confusing, noisy, like a real battlefield situation would be, then they'll be that much more effective as a unit in a real battlefield environment.
With the rise of 3D, America re-entered the games industry for the first time since the crash of 1983, challenging Japan's tech industry, just as DARPA's quest for machine learning and advanced AI had tried to in the 1980s. This resurgence of an American-led games industry occurred by popularizing new kinds of video games that were, frankly, militarized, and arguably nothing short of propagandistic. In the completely artificial confines of a digital environment, the meaning of war, as publicly perceived, becomes manipulatable. In accordance with Desert Storm, which largely reframed the use of military force for the masses as something surgical, smart, and above all else, clean, video games throughout the 90s and into the turn of the century did much to facilitate the desired wider shift away from the post-Vietnam era's characteristic distrust of military force. Arguably, an entire generation, my generation, in this case of mostly boys and young men, were targeted for basically brainwashing, as image training and glorification of a version of force that seemed peaceful started up a mass process of something like basic training for digital child soldiers. Is it possible the military's close and important role in shaping the technology and even paradigms of the games industry has snuck through the back door a form of image training to ensure a permanent end to what Ronald Reagan once dubbed the Vietnam Syndrome? Are games potentially the next generation for Hollywood and the power it once held over minds, both in terms of the conscious and unconscious? MGS2 used Raiden, the S3 plan, and the concepts of military simulations in VR to indirectly bring these controversial yet crucial subjects to the fore of gaming culture for the first time. It continues to resonate to this day, in part because of them.
The HellMD demo is all about showcasing this system for the warfighters and showing them in a tactical environment what the system can actually do. Really demonstrating that this is not a science fiction thing, it's here, it's today, it's ready to go.
Basically, we can operate the entire system with two people. You have a driver who also helps with emplacement and displacement. And then you have an operator.
We want to be able to run it, single guy from a single laptop with an Xbox controller. Something that he doesn't have to go to school to learn for years and years, but something that he knows how to use instinctively.
That's a fantastic capability for the military. I mean, two people, two.
Now that we have the system locked in, we've been achieving a very high rate of kill.
We can't wait to see what else they have to throw at us.
Let me be clear, because what I'm saying is easily misunderstood. I'm not saying games are bad for people, even bad for children. I'm of the view that even violent games don't carry much risk in of themselves. The problem is not games. In my opinion, it's what those games are being exploited to do. If these games could exist without the RMA and endless war, there'd be no problem. But we need to face that they came out of the RMA, technologically speaking. There are certain things that games, because of this, are just better at doing. And they've arguably played, unwittingly, a key role in changing how our society, particularly our young people, see war. Recruiting a soldier today is, I assert, easier than ever before because the military has a multi-billion-dollar games industry completely footing the bill for its advertising. And it's in the publishers, and sometimes even the developers' best interests to pretend as if their game offers that coveted degree of authenticity, which, as simulations, video games, many players feel, ought to have.
Call of Duty has always been a sort of a window into a world that you would only see on the news. It had to do service to that reality, and it couldn't just be a Hollywood depiction. We're working with our Navy SEAL consultants, and they were training our actors, training our animators, and training our designers how they move realistically through spaces. We're not trained operators, obviously, although we try to be as immersed in that world as we possibly can. But we were still operating under the pretense that you kick down a door and you say, everybody throw your hands up, and you just come in with shock and awe. And our operators were like, well, we don't do anything like that.
In the shadows, they send us in to find it.
For us, the challenge was, if we want this game to be authentic and realistic and not a kind of a cliched Hollywood depiction of war, then we've got to ask them, what are some themes that are universal to your experience that you feel that we could do justice to in our game?
That brings us back to MGS2. Within this context, strange elements in Sons of Liberty, like the presence of a vampire, a Doc Ock-looking villain, and other implausible and even impossible things, serve important roles beyond simply making playing MGS2 outrageously fun. Next to the equally unbelievable pseudo-realism of the game's environments, enemy AI, and mechanics, these clearly unreal or hyper-real elements intrude on the realism because they're supposed to. This off-putting digital fusion, I claim, is there to make a point about video games. Typically, action games are one or the other. They're clearly cartoony, like, say, Halo, or they're super pseudo-realistic, like, say, Splinter Cell. By being both at the same time, MGS2 is a warning never to forget that no simulation, no matter how compelling, is a true version of reality. And all simulations, one way or another, are built with a particular purpose in mind. A purpose of instruction. This purpose is largely defined from what facets of reality it leaves in and which it filters out. Something we might connect back to one of MGS2's central cinematic influences, The Matrix. In The Matrix, the simulation and reality have become totally indistinguishable, and for this reason, while the human race thinks it's inside the real world, the actual real world they've been closed off from is so horrible and nightmarish that it more resembles science fiction. The world's been sold a cleaner, safer-seeming reality, never given the chance to see this mind control and psychological domination by machines for what it really is. Games aren't the problem. The problem is when games provide us with more meaning and with a more convincing version of our own reality and that formerly final bastion of the real warfare than anything we can encounter for ourselves in the real world. As one of my viewers pointed out, MGS2 gradually transitions from extremely realistic weapons and equipment to, by the point we enter Arsenal gear, full-blown science fiction. Even the final two boss battles have a sense of the hyper-real to them. The endless procession of Metal Gear Rays feel like enemies out of something like Super Mario Bros. Or an arcade game, and the one-on-one between Raiden and Solidus feels almost like a fighting game. As Kojima himself remarked, Solidus's swords are actually named Sword of Republicanism and Sword of Democracy. We've hinted all along that MGS2 wants to critique, maybe most of all, the American view of science, reason, and its philosophical predecessor, the Enlightenment. This almost certainly goes back to the fundamental message of MGS as a whole, which is anti-nuke. The nuclear bomb was the byproduct of so-called rationality, as the opening of MGS2 informs us. Yet the use of it and its effects have never been seriously scrutinized or questioned by the American public. All of those calculations necessary for the incidents at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in of themselves rational, sure. The science was sound, but the underlying motive for using them was arguably inhuman. Some have even argued, in the perfect illustration of the concept of turtles all the way down, that the US simply had to drop the A-bombs on Japan because they were so expensive to make. Republicanism and democracy are seen as objectively superior to all other forms of governance. And maybe they are. But isn't that just the result of predefining your terms, so that best and most objectively civilized become synonymous with democratic republic? Ironically, many Soviet bloc nations would use this phrase, democratic republic, and even today, many which use it in their name are scarcely recognizable as real democracies or republics. Even the US political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, use these phrases without really understanding what they originally meant. Language gets in the way of objectivity, arguably, which often enough can turn even the most high-minded ideals and well-rehearsed speeches into little more than weapons, swords. Questioning the objectivity of how the US has historically lived up to its own Enlightenment values, and whether, for that matter, any nation really can be as objective culturally as, say, pure science, is not unlike questioning whether the masses consume military games because they objectively demand them. Every year, inevitably, a Call of Duty, a Doom, Halo, or Battlefield-style game will sit at the top 10. Every election, inevitably, a Democrat or Republican becomes president. But are these choices really decided by demand, in liberty, or decided by supply? And imposed in secret, much as the atomic bomb was developed, planned, and dropped in secret. The little-known reason why the President of the United States has unilateral control over the dropping of nuclear weapons actually goes back to Truman being so horrified by the fact that the military-industrial complex had decided to embark upon this venture that he immediately changed the law so that only he could have the overriding say. But even now, that just begs the question of whether the post of the presidency is too powerful. On this subject of supply and demand, to quote Strategic Computing, DARPA, and the quest for machine intelligence, quote, just as customers for electricity had to be invented in the late 19th century, so too did DARPA have to invent uses for intelligent machines in the 1980s, end quote. In 1994, the Smithsonian came under fire by Democrats and Republicans alike for its controversial decision to attempt and show the effects of the atomic bomb on Japan objectively. Alongside the presence of the plane used to conduct the mission, the Enola Gay, the museum had planned to show, to quote the New York Times from back then, the horrible effects of the atomic bombs, and a long section on the post-war nuclear race. The critics said the discussion did not belong in the exhibit, and was part of a politically loaded message that the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan began a dark chapter in human history. The museum will now omit items the critics said dwelt to excess, and also vastly revise the estimates of how many casualties might have resulted if the bombs had not been used, end quote. All I'm getting at is that even if perfectly sane, logical processes and systems are present, it merely begs the question, what are they being used for? The creation of nuclear weapons, the existence of violent video games, they're both perfectly fine in a vacuum, and in some contexts they could even be necessary, or at the very least, preferable. The question, the problem that I want and MGS2 seemingly wants to ask is, according to what flawed, imperfect, all too human interpretation of reality? According to who and what's interests are these in of themselves perfectly logical creations being created, justified, and ultimately exploited for? The collapse of the Cold War brought a major shift that reverberated all across the military-industrial complex. budgets were slashed, which precipitated, as MGS1 mentions, a huge series of mergers and sell-offs within the defense contractor market, as consolidation ate up companies and produced only a handful of mega-contractor corporations on the other end, like Lockheed Martin. The military and its economic support system had to adapt. At the time, this was referred to as the so-called peace dividend. More and more, the solution for the still massive defense society's survival came down to privatization and a fundamental redefinition of what the military meant to the public. To pay for itself outside its publicly mandated budget, the Pentagon became a profit maker of its own by so-called defense conversion, selling dual-use technology to the private sector. Defense contractors rebranded themselves, and as a result of these changes, the military and digital civilization became more than ever joined at the hip. To quote the U.S. Army's own Program Executive Office for Simulation, Training, and Instrumentation, quote, "The entertainment and military communities became reacquainted in the 1990s. Military simulations like SimNet and Modular Semi-Automated Forces, ModSAF, were beginning to explore the graphic tools emerging from academic research laboratories and commercialized by companies like Silicon Graphics. Traditional military training games were recreated in a gaming form and sold for entertainment. Programmers for DARPA's SimNet, used in the Gulf War, were even, quote, hired by Sony Computer Entertainment to create the multiplayer software for online PlayStation titles. At the same time, entertainment games and the technologies behind them seeped as well into the military domain," end quote. For example, today, the military and contractors like Raytheon regularly appropriate commercial gaming technology like the Xbox 360 controller or even the PS3, which according to Wired magazine in 2008 provided the basis for something called Roadrunner, quote, "the latest world's fastest computer that provides classified data to help assess the safety and readiness of the US nuclear arsenal," end quote, as well as for next-gen computer simulations of nuclear tests. By merging together so completely with the digital entertainment industry, the military and its contractors have unified purposes, both commercial and strategic. The possibility that this merger could in fact conceal a new and dangerous kind of propaganda, bordering on mind control, has never seriously been addressed or considered by lawmakers or the public at large. Through a back channel, we have arguably ceded cultural control of America, the biggest nation on Earth, to the interests and profit margins of its warrior classes and mega war profiteers. And the result has been, to some extent, a regaining of control over the wider question of context. Given the crucial relationship between the US military and its technology innovators, it was only natural that the military and video games, the format that made digital machines popular, as something more than tools, and as culture, would go hand in hand. In fact, the fundamental nature of games as forms of simulations owe their entire existence to the Pentagon and its war planning, particularly during the nuclear age. Quote, "Simulation is the act of modeling a system A by a less complex system B, which retains some of A's original behavior." Gonzalo Frasia. The use of simulations, war games, and training exercises is of course much older than the digital age. But in the modern era, computer simulations are much more realistic, and most actual large-scale warfare since World War II has become a thing of the past. Training and drilling for combat readiness have mostly replaced actual warfighting, and often, whenever military combat does take place, it's mediated by computer screens and unmanned aerial systems. The development of such systems can be traced right alongside the lifespan of video games, not to mention nuclear weapons. The question MGS2 poses is whether or not this so-called revolution in military affairs, which has confronted us since, Desert Storm, and which gave us games in 3D, represents some kind of erasure of the full brutality of warfare, and a replacement of its reality with its simulation, with its meme. For many my age, before we could even legally vote, we knew all the names of the coolest guns, knew the difference between automatics and semi-autos, and depending on our own specific VR regimen, knew, without realizing we knew it, fundamentals of things like piloting a fighter jet, watching our ammo count, and so on. And all of this we paid for as part of a private industry, and not directly as state-imposed re-education. By the end of the 90s, especially following the Columbine massacre, violent video games did attract some negative press, but what the debate around violence in video games largely missed by making it yet another front in the left versus right culture wars was that realism and professional-grade combat simulation was never actually the point. This, after all, is the postmodern era. To the contrary, the point was the non-realism, or what postmodern thinkers have called the hyper-real. The hyper-reality of video game violence arguably represented its true danger. The point, I claim, was never to provide scores of boys and young men with real and substantive combat training. The degree to which that would even be possible through just a video game is null. It was actually about, again, arguably, building a zero level for potential recruits and support, building militarization of pop culture at large. And as Snake explains to Raiden,
the only difference is it isn't actually happening.
That's the way they want you to think, to remove you from the fear that goes with battle situations. War is a video game. What better way to raise the ultimate soldier?
removing the sense of reality, both for soldiers but also for the wider public, from actual combat situations, whether participating directly or simply spectating from afar. The psychological reformatting of how the future's voters and soldiers in America would see the very concept of war change at the turn of the century would prove necessary, arguably, to provide the military with fodder for real training and deployment, not to mention support for what would rapidly become an endless war. The further removed from reality actual combat could become, the better chances the military would preempt another highly unpopular Vietnam scenario. Within the actual military itself, meanwhile, the pursuit of so-called total battlefield awareness and the use of BOS, battlefield operating systems, meant the individual soldier could become just another cog, another Metal Gear in the wider machine, part of a system or machine that required very little from him or her in terms of actual conscious thought. What used to require experience, skill, wisdom, and courage now could, in theory, be automated, or so that was the goal. And basically every soldier would become of equal value. No longer would a scarcity of individual talent or experience be a detriment to effective mobilization. Some of these themes, ironically, were actually tackled in the original MGS1, by way of the Genome Army, which was, in the science fiction parallel universe of MGS, the Pentagon's approach to solving the exact same problem. By computerizing the entire process and procedure of war, every soldier could be directed, assisted, and controlled, in theory, within a single faceless system, while every citizen would give their tacit support. This meant war crimes, in theory, would, if they did not become a thing of the past, escape the public's interest. And operations could be conducted along a single unified program, without fear of losing the masses' hearts and minds. All the individual soldier needed to do in this emerging so-called revolution in military affairs was lose themselves in the simulation of actually fighting a war. All the individual voter needed to do was appreciate the emerging illusion that it provided of peace. At no point would anyone consciously come into contact with reality, and as a result, World War II-style full mobilization of society would be in sight. As MGS2 conveys, we can see elements of what I'm describing simply in the modular conceptual properties of the terrorist. Training, drills, and simulations do not differentiate between one terrorist group or another, because their tactics will roughly always be the same. That means one terrorist, much like within the military's own units, is really no different substantively than another. Dealing with one of these digital terrorists is not unlike operations within a program, one that can repeat, in theory, indefinitely. There is no end to this war. There is no terminus to the program. There are simply parameters, operations, inputs, and outcomes, none of which are tethered to any conventional notion of warfare, so they appear on the surface to be a cleaner, safer battlefield. Divorced from the substance of reality, terrorist versus counter-terrorist engagements can, as we see literally in the modern popular shooter Counter-Strike, go on indefinitely. There is no long-term territory to be lost or won. There is no wider war to really win. MGS2 saw the relevance terrorism and special forces operations would play to the nature of 21st century warfare well in advance. That Dead Cell become really the terrorist threat they were formed merely to simulate makes this convergence between simulation and reality clear. As Pliskin says, their purpose is to train soldiers as the ultimate simulation. The new reality to their threat level merely makes Dead Cell much more useful and effective, not to mention much more entertaining. In MGS2, as a metaphor for the emerging paradigm of the terrorist guerrilla force, as a simulated, hyperreal, even phantom foe. In the 20th century, Hollywood once shaped public opinion and wider perceptions. After the 70s gave us one downer anti-war movie after another, it was in the 80s that we had action films that began this wider process of image training. But since the 80s, video games have gone on to achieve many of the same goals in ways that make Hollywood action movies seem quaint. Again, the point isn't realism, but to the contrary, making hyperrealism much more preferable and much harder to separate from the grim reality.
We were shown Hollywood action films every day. The kind with macho guys and big guns. They call it image training. They built us from the ground up into killing machines.
The early era of modern gaming MGS2 sets out to criticize was defined largely by spectacle, just as the Gulf War was. By visceral gut punch simu stimulation. What mattered, even plot or characters? The powerful thrill boys could get, the almost drug-like high, was a draw all on its own. And thanks to aggressive marketing campaigns, boys knew who these games were designed self-servingly to target. Even now, a huge subset of gamers, at least in America, rally around video games as aspects of a macho male identity, seeing difficulty and degree of violence as ways of life, almost as if they were former members of a real military unit who long for action and don't know how to reintegrate into civilian society. The sense not only of entertainment but of identity that 90s games offered this generation, particularly the males, has left lasting damage. One example of something the digitized revolution has helped cover up is the use of radiological WMD weaponry against Iraq and Afghanistan. This isn't a conspiracy theory. No nukes have been dropped, but according to Peter Balfour's The Rise of Authoritarian Liberal Democracy, quote, during the 1991 Gulf War, depleted uranium or DU bullets and shells were widely used by US forces because of DU's ability to cut through conventional armor plating. Radioactive, toxic uranium alloys and hard target uranium warheads were subsequently used by US-led coalition forces in 2001 in Afghanistan and during the second attack of Iraq in 2003, end quote. Balfour goes on, quote, the lethality of DU weaponry can be extreme because the radiation produced by depleted uranium in battle is a poison, a carcinogenic material that causes birth defects, lung disease, kidney disease, leukemia, breast cancer, lymphoma, bone cancer, and neurological disabilities. When depleted uranium munitions explode, the air is bathed in a fine radioactive dust which carries on the wind and is easily inhaled, and eventually enters the soil, pollutes groundwater, and enters the food chain, end quote. Quote, the Uranium Medical Research Center reported that uranium contamination in Afghan civilians' urine samples found abnormally high levels of non-depleted uranium, 400 to 2,000% higher than normal population baselines. The US-led forces helped irradiate the local environment with unspeakable civilian health implications, end quote. The percentage of birth defects in Iraq are extremely high to this very day. Today, if you notice, neither so-called left nor so-called right in America particularly generally care about the military-industrial complex. I claim it's a direct result of the military entertainment complex, of militarizing American pop culture, masculinizing gamer violence, and detaching war from reality. Because of these reasons, I argue, the US, in tandem with private military companies, have been engaged for decades in what's been called the Forever War. A war that's gone on so long, it's become perceived as normal, as a normal feature of a present peace. There are people who are coming of age today that have never lived at a time when there was not war.
We're not just pawns in some simulation game, you know.
Yes, you are. You're nothing but mere weapons. No different from fighter jets or tanks.
What the?
The old model destroyed 4 years ago was Rex.
The new amphibious model is Ray.
Both of these are the same as the code names used by the U.S. Armed Forces to refer to Japanese warplanes during World War II.
Your code name, Raiden, too, comes from the Japanese Navy's name for one of its interceptors.
Stop it. I'm not a weapon.
Oh, really? Do you know the code name the U.S. Armed Forces used for the Japanese fighter Raiden?
It was Jack. Both of you are just weapons to be used and thrown away.
Just weapons to be used on the battlefield. Just pawns in a game, exactly as you said.
And a weapon has no right to think for itself.
In closing, it's not a question of violent and propagandistic content. It's the context that's changed. That's taken something as harmless and as fantastic as games and recontextualized them into would-be Trojan horses of psychological warfare, arguably, to be used against America's own public, not to mention the world. It's not the potentially endless war games themselves that I want to challenge or critique here, it's the reality of endless war that they've seemed to correspond with, that they've arguably been hijacked to safeguard. Or at least that's one interpretation. After all, there's no such thing as absolute reality. Until next time, boss.